Good evening. This is Robert Sungenis coming to you once again via Facebook for our weekly open question program set aside for you to ask any questions you have about the science of cosmology, cosmogony, anything related to our movie The Principle, our movie Journey to the Center of the Universe, and any of the books that we have out, which, by the way, I want to advertise tonight, as I always try to do for those who are new to The Principle and are just getting interested in the topic. We have several sources for you that will help your education into this area. A very fascinating area, especially today with all the instrumentation we have, examining the cosmos and examining all that's out there. It's quite bewildering. Unless you have the map, the key, which we have, and are not ashamed to say so. We have the key because the key is given to us by divine revelation, and the science that we discover just backs it up 100%. That's a bold claim, of course, but when you have the truth, you make no excuses, you show no shame. And we have the truth, and we're here to give it to you. Excuse me, something in my eye. And so we're going to, again, set aside this program for you from 7 to 8 to ask your questions. Before we do that, however, let me bring some advertisements to you. Now we have the good old standby. Some of you who have delved deep into the topic are familiar with this book. Excuse the glare on the page there. Galileo was wrong, the church was right. Evidence from Modern Science, Volume 1. This is now in its 12th edition. Okay. Little bedtime reading there for you. Okay. You can get through it in no time, at least a couple weeks. Spend some time every night. 750 pages. And that's not all. Volume 2 is Volume 2 about the evidence from modern science, and that is just about as big as this one, and comes in a 6x9 frame, hardback, paperback, whatever you like. It's even on PDF. You can get this at Galileo Was Wrong DVD. That's gwww.dvd.com. That website also contains Journey to the Center of the Universe.com. And I think those are the only two places you can get it. So that is available for those who really want to delve deep into the subject. For those of you who just want to get your feet wet, I came out with a new book. Again, excuse the glare here. I'm trying to get rid of the glare for you. Geocentrism for Dumbskies and Smart Kids. This is about 250 pages. I'll just show you the inside. It's in full color. Okay, and everything that you wanted to know about cosmology from the geocentric standpoint, but were afraid to ask, is covered in there, and much more. The previous book, Galileo Was Wrong, it was basically an expansion of this book and getting into the finer details of the subject. And we have our old book, Geocentrism 101, that was written a few years before, Geocentrism for Dumbskies. This book has additional information, believe it or not. Yes, you can tell this is a complex subject, and we try to cover every angle of it, every nook and cranny, so that nothing is left undone for those who are interested in delving into it, and even for our critics who want to know all about it. And let me see what else we have. We have our movies, as you know. The Principle. This was a movie that came out in 2014. The Principle, it says, the universe is trying to tell us something. Are we listening? Okay, that movie was in theaters in 2014, October, and we put it in about 15 other theaters until about April 2015, and then we ran out of money. At any rate, we did get into the theaters, and this movie is available on theprinciple.com, theprinciplemovie.com website, $14.95 for you. So we tried to make it as inexpensive as possible. Still relevant today, and will be relevant for the next 10 to 15 years before they send up other satellites to try to discover what went wrong for the first 3 satellites they sent up and didn't find what they wanted to find. They found the universe has a center, and that center is Earth. That's what they found by their own scientific evidence. And we put it all in the Principle, and we have some of the most famous cosmologists, astronomers, astrophysicists in this movie. They are interviewed by us. Michio Kaku, Lawrence Krauss, Max Tegmark, MIT, George F.R. Ellis, probably the premier physicist in the world today, and then a few others. So all there for your viewing pleasure, and you'll hear it right from the horse's mouth. At any rate, so that's one movie we have. Then we made a sequel to that. Again, I'm trying to get rid of the glare here for you. There we go. Journey to the Center of the Universe, a scientific documentary. This was not in theaters, but it is available on DVD. 4.5 hours of your viewing pleasure. The Principle was an hour and a half. Because we had to put it in theaters, we had to trim it down to an hour and a half. But this is a DVD documentary, and 4.5 hours, so you can imagine what we put in there. And that's just the sequel to what we couldn't cover in the Principle. We decided to cover in this follow-up, this sequel. And so all the information is there for you, okay? This one, I believe, is, there's 2 discs in here, 2 DVD discs, and I think that is running $24.95. I'm not quite sure. Either that or $29.95, one or the other. And this is also available at the gwww.dvd.com website or journeytothecenteroftheuniverse.com website. Okay, and on the Principle website, it's also for sale, and I think if my director has gotten to it, we made a package deal between the Principle, the Journey to the Center of the Universe, and my other movie that just came out. I put that free on YouTube. It's now called Einstein, the Closet Geocentrist. The former title, which was also good, but this one was much better. The former title was The Fool on the Hill. And if everybody wonders why I named it that, and you have to be as old as I am in order to know why. And there was this group, I'm sure you've heard of them, called the Beatles, and Paul McCartney wrote this song called The Fool on the Hill. And in that song, he has a verse that says, the fool on the hill sees the sun going down, but the eyes in his head see the world spinning round. And I think that was written in 1967. So we're way back in time. And that passage is talking about someone who sees the sun going down, but He doesn't believe the sun is moving. He believes the earth is spinning round. And that's what most people think today, you see. So that's why I chose the title, The Fool on the Hill. But then again, I figured, well, maybe someone isn't catching on to my deep thought in that title and needs something a little simpler. And after reviewing the movie again, I figured, well, you know, most of it is about Albert Einstein, and because he basically leads a modern science today. Whatever is taught today in modern cosmology or astrophysics or astronomy is all based on teachings of Albert Einstein. There's no way around that, both his special and general relativity. But few people know that Einstein's trajectory from special relativity to general relativity dictated to him that the very thing he tried to avoid, which was an Earth in the center of the universe, with the universe revolving around it, is the very thing he ended up with in his general relativity theory. And that's because of the general principle of relativity that he got stuck with. Never intended it that way, but that's just the way it turned out for him. But that's little advertised. And so I wanted to make it crystal clear to everybody that that's exactly where he ended up. And that's why I call it Einstein, the Closet Geocentrist. And you can find that on YouTube. So go visit that. If you have 2.47 hours to spare, please view it. I put a lot of work into it, and it's well worth your time, believe it or not. Okay, so I'm going to take some questions. I see we have our chat box here filled with questions, so let me start here with Ben. Ben, how you doing? I'm going to start charging you too, Ben. You're getting some free information here. I'm just kidding you. Ben says, hi, Robert. Do you think that man set foot on the moon in 1969? It seems to me that if the moon landing were a hoax, as many people say, then the Russians would have tracked where the Apollo rocket actually went. They would have said something about it, but they never did. Also, with thousands of people involved in the whole U.S. space program, it would have been difficult to keep a secret among that many people if it were a hoax. Is there a scientific way to show that the moon landing in 1969 actually happened, such as by looking through a high-powered telescope and viewing the flag that the astronauts left on the moon? If the moon landing can be verified somehow, that would also definitely prove that the Earth is a sphere, as the astronauts say they photographed it. That would put the rest of the flat Earth question once and for all. That would put to rest the flat Earth question once and for all. Okay, so Ben, let me take your questions here one at a time. First of all, do you think that man set foot on the moon in 1969? Let me be very frank with you. I have my doubts about it. Okay, I would hope to believe in it. You know, I want to believe in it. But as a scientist and as a man of truth, at least as much as I try to be, with the evidence that I have, there are doubts, okay? And those doubts have not been answered by some of the retorts that NASA has put out there to answer the question. I think basically they left it in a neutral place with the answers that they've given. I've just seen too many films. I've seen too many critical essays and critical films from very competent people. You know, there's a lot of fly-by-night people out there, okay? There's a lot of quacks and kooks and, you know, people out for themselves. But there are some very well put together critical views of the so-called moon landing, okay? And I think that we also have to take into account the fact that we were in a race with the Russians to see who could commandeer outer space first. And when Sputnik went up in 1957, that changed the world. It was the first time that a nation of the Earth sent a satellite into orbit. Okay, so that told us that the Russians were way ahead of us. You know, we had thought that after World War II everything was hunky-dory. We beat the Germans and their V-2 rockets, and you know, we had our technical advancements that we used in airplanes and submarines and things like that. But not much was given to outer space, or, you know, space that's actually very near to us, you know, maybe 500 miles up. So the Russians were the first, and so we were in a space race. And the Russians became our mortal enemies, basically, at that time, because after we fought over Europe and the breaking up of Germany, and, you know, met and decided who was going to take control of what portion of Germany and who was going to have the other, you know, East and West Germany, and all the satellites around it, you know, the Russians became our chief enemy. The Chinese were nowhere near, you know, the advancements of the United States and Russia, nor was India. They were just coming around. So it was just us, basically. And we saw evidence of that again in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. You know, and we know that the Russians had an atomic bomb in their embassy in Washington, D.C. during Kennedy's administration. So things were hot and heavy between the Russians and the United States. So the political scene itself suggests that, you know, to come off the snuff, the United States had to do something. Landing a man on the moon, you know, that would do the trick, basically. It would show that we were superior to the Russians and the political game would be in our favor. And so we had every incentive that if we couldn't do it truthfully, that we might be tempted to do it untruthfully, pretend that we went there. I'm not saying that this is proof. I'm just saying that this is the political climate that was apparent at that time, and we have to take that into consideration. Okay, technology-wise, you know, the old saying is that the computer capability that Apollo 11 had was less than what I have in my watch that runs by a little computer. Okay. You know, at that time, I think the computer space, even the best ones, could only hold 20 megabytes. And if you went over 20 megabytes, they would reboot, and you would lose everything that you had stored previously. That's how inefficient they were. Okay, this is 1969 now we're talking about. Even in the 1970s, they had computers in the IBM offices that were as big as buildings, you know, due to the technology that was so primitive. All right, so sending a man to the moon is a, you know, it's quite an endeavor. The other thing is, you know, nowadays it's not so hard to send, you know, a satellite to the moon. You could send it to the moon very easily, have it orbit the moon, and either drift off into space or come back to Earth. You could send something to Mars. We sent Voyager 1 out, Voyager 10 and 11 out. They're out of the solar system now. And so, you know, that's quite feasible now. But the question remains is, can you send a man into outer space and land him on the moon? That's the issue. You see, aluminum is not an organic tissue that would deteriorate within seconds by radiation bombardment. It can survive because it's not a living thing. But when you're talking about sending a man into space that has very limited parameters as in his environment as to what will allow him to survive that environment, he has to have exactly the right temperature. You see, he has to have exactly the right pressure. He cannot be deterred by radiation, and it's intense in outer space. They know that. Okay, so these are the factors that make intelligent people. Okay, these are not just conspiracy theorists. All right, that's the way that a lot of these people are dismissed, because once they, everybody hears the word conspiracy theorist, they run for the hills. But you can look on the internet and see 33 of the so-called conspiracy theories that were touted, say, from the 1930s to the present, or to the 1970s. They all turned out to be true. Okay, but in their day, when they first came out, they were called conspiracy theories. Okay, so that shouldn't deter anyone from trying to get to the truth by being called a conspiracy theorist. This is not to say that there aren't conspiracy theorists. Okay, this is to say that not everyone who doubts the official story is a conspiracy theorist. Okay, in the derogatory sense. They believe there is a conspiracy, and they have a theory of what actually happened, but it doesn't mean that they're wrong. Okay, you have to sift these things out like you sift out everything else to find the truth from the falsity. Okay, so let me move on with your question, because I think there were some other things I wanted to hit here. It seems to me that if the moon landing were a hoax, as many people say, then the Russians would have tracked where the Apollo rocket actually went. They would have said something about it, but they never did. Well, here's where I think you make an assumption that you don't know whether it's true or not, whether the Russians would have said something. Okay, I mean, the Russians could have easily been paid off. Okay, we'll give you this if you keep your mouth shut. Something like that, or we'll give you this land, or we'll give you this trade agreement, or we'll do this, and all underhanded, all clandestine. Okay, because if the Apollo thing was clandestine, the reprieve to Russia to keep their mouths shut would have been clandestine too. Okay, so it's not out of the realm of possibility that the Russians could have been offered a deal to keep their mouths shut if they knew what was going on. Okay, and that's just the way the world is. There's deals made everywhere. I mean, let's go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. I mean, Kennedy is propped up like a man who has to make this grave decision about whether he is going to tell the Russians that if they come any further with their ships, then there's going to be World War III. Okay, but the truth is, the United States already had missiles aimed at Russia that were based in Turkey. And they made a deal with the Russians that said, if we take these missiles out of Turkey, will you take your missiles out of Cuba? That was part of the deal. Okay, so we have all this dramatic staging of an event where the Russians are sending their ships, but the deal had already been made. Okay, the Russians were going to turn their ships around unless they got word from the Kremlin that the deal was off and they should keep the ships going. Okay, that was one possibility, but the Kremlin never did that. All right, so here is the art of the deal, so to speak, and this is the way a lot of politics is made today between countries. There's deals, all kinds of deals made everywhere that we never know about, and we only find out about them later. I mean, go back to 1967 with the Vietnam War, the escalation of the Vietnam War. And this is one of those 33 conspiracy theories that actually turned out not to be a conspiracy. It was actually true. And that is the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where, I don't know, I'm not going to give you all the details here, but basically it was the fact that President Johnson okayed the bombing of a ship in the Gulf of Tonkin, the bombing of a U.S. ship, to make it look like the Vietnamese had done it. And so now we have an excuse to escalate the war in Vietnam. You know, this didn't come out till many, many years later, all right? But that was the case. And that's a fact, all right? So to say that, you know, it would not be in the realm of possibility for the United States government to fake a moon landing for the same political reasons, no, I don't think we can say that safely. Not what we know about our U.S. government. I mean, sometimes the U.S. government plays it fair and safe and true. Other times they don't, because from their vantage point, we live in an evil world, and if we don't take advantage of that, then somebody else is, and they're going to rule over us. And so you'll use any means necessary, good, bad, or indifferent, to accomplish their purposes, okay? Because it's all a matter of survival. Who's going to rule the world, basically? And, you know, that enters into a lot of decisions. So it's not just a matter of, you know, landing a man on the moon. There's it hits many, many, many areas of life. And we've just covered the surface of that. And then again, it says, also with the thousands of people involved in the whole U.S. space program, it would have been difficult to keep a secret among that many people if it were a hoax. Well, here's again an instance where I think you make an assumption that may not be true, okay? First of all, let's take an example where most of the intellectual members of society and members of the U.S. government were kept in the dark about something that was happening, and that was the Manhattan Project. Okay, that was the project to create the atomic bomb. And as you know, they were successful because it went off in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. But that was kept under wraps. And even if I remember correctly, even the Vice President of the United States wasn't told about the Manhattan Project. And so you can imagine how many officials, maybe even the Chief of Staff of the Army and his members weren't told. I mean, it was kept secret. And it was kept secret for many years. And they accomplished their goal, okay? And so there's an instance where hundreds of thousands of people who even worked in the facility didn't even know what was going on. It was kept under wraps. Very, very few people. You could probably count them on, in a range of about 25 people who may have known about what was actually going on in the Manhattan Project. And everybody else was kept in the dark. So the recipe's already there. It's already been tried out, and it was successful, that you can keep many people who even work there in the dark, okay? And even if they happen to know, I mean, come on, the pressure that can be put on them, like, their lives or their families' lives, or they could be bribed, or, there's all kinds of ways to convince people not to say what they know. Okay, so, I mean, we live in that kind of a world, all right? So that's not outside the realm of possibility, so you can't assume that. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that you're wrong. I'm just saying that there's a lot of doubt there, okay? And if you're going to be a mature, intellectual adult, you have to face these things. You just can't hide yourself hide your head in the sand and think that it's always going to go right. And the best moral quality is always going to be produced by those in charge. If you think that way, you're quite naive. I mean, just take a look at our Democratic Party right now. That's changed so much in the last few decades, you can't even recognize it anymore. I mean, poor Joe Biden, he can't even keep ahead of all the changes because he's from the old school. He's from the, the 70s and 80s and 90s, where the Democrats were at least, morally circumspect to a certain degree. Okay, but now all the barriers are taken away. Okay, things have changed that much. All right, so things can happen to a society, and bad decisions can be made from it. All right, and I could go on and on about that, but I think you get the drift. Could you look through a high-power telescope and view? That's a good question. The Hubble telescope is right out there. All you have to do is train the Hubble telescope on tranquility base to see if there is a lunar module there. I mean, the Hubble telescope is so powerful it can see out to galaxies that are hundreds of millions of light years away, so we're told. Okay, so why don't you train it on the moon's surface? I mean, a satellite, a GPS satellite, can see a grass blade growing in my yard, or a tree, or a flower. All right, so send a satellite that hovers above the moon at the same distance that the GPS hovers above the Earth. Take a picture. Okay? Has it ever been done? No. All right? Now, there are pictures that have been purported to have been taken, or let's say that the photos actually have been taken. Okay? And I show these in my book, Flat Earth, Flat Wrong, where NASA has published pictures of supposedly equipment that was left on the lunar surface. And they label them all and, and say this is this, and this is this, and this. And there's like, half a dozen things in this perimeter. But you look at it and it's all out of focus. You can't tell what you're looking at. And this is supposed to be done by the Lunar Reconnaissance craft. They actually have a special craft that goes and analyzes the surface of the moon. And the best pictures that they have given us, you can find them on the internet. You can't tell what you're looking at. And they'll say, this is the lunar module over here. All you see is a white square or a white rectangle. Okay? So obviously that's no proof. So this just raises suspicion. If you have the ability to see a plant growing in my yard from a GPS satellite, why don't you have the ability with a lunar reconnaissance aircraft to take a decent picture in focus that we can say, oh, there's the lunar module, intact? Never happened. Okay? So these kinds of things, just generate suspicion among all the other suspicion that has been generated over the last few years. Okay, so again, all right, so I think we've done enough of that. Let me go on to Ignacio's question. Hello, Dr. Sungenis. I wanted to ask you about the latest research regarding the axis of evil. Are there any new developments? No. No new developments. They have something planned for, what year is that? 1920, or say 2023, I think. What they call the array telescopes. Now this is it's not exactly the same thing, but hi, this is Robert Sungenis coming back from our program for September the 19th. Mysteriously, we got cut off again somehow. The same thing keeps happening on Facebook, almost every program we have. I had a program last night where it didn't happen. We were on for a whole hour without being cut off. So I don't know what's happening. If the connection's good enough to start and end, it's good enough to continue. So I can't tell. I can't explain to you what's happening. But we were on a question about the axis of evil, and one of our participants had asked if there was any developments to the axis of evil, and I was in the process of answering that question, so let me continue with it. They do plan what they call the array telescope experiment, say around 2023, and what they're going to do is look at the whole sky from a different angle, so to speak. And what they're going to do is get all these radio telescopes, maybe 50 of them or 100 of them, and put them all side by side in some place in the outskirts of Arizona. And I'm not sure exactly how it's going to work, so I don't want to say how it's going to operate. But that's their next experiment, if it comes through. And that's supposed to examine what the WMAP satellite and the Planck satellite had examined, perhaps in finer detail, because they'll have so many different radio telescopes pointing at the same thing. So they figure that, if the evidence is true from what we found with the axis of evil and the Planck satellite, that this will either be denied or verified by these new array telescopes. So we'll see. Okay, but to answer your question, no, not much has happened. As it stands now, the principle stands unrefuted, because the axis of evil that they found is still there. Okay. For those of you who don't know what we're talking about, let me just give you a brief history as people start to come back to our program. And again, I'm sorry for this. It's out of my hands, so I don't know what is going on with Facebook. And I may turn to another venue. I don't know. I'll have to figure that out. At any rate, what had the Big Bang Theory said that when the explosion occurred, the big explosion, the matter and energy were spewed out from this point, and it was done isotropically, okay, evenly spread out. And there might be a little anisotropy in the explosion, but not much, just enough to make, stars and galaxies, who are just basically dots in a, humongous universe. So basically, most of the explosion would be isotropic, and that's what you would expect to find if you were looking at this explosion 13 billion years later. You would expect the same smoothness. And their theory, even though they allowed a little agitation to that smoothness, only allowed a little bit, okay? But what they found when they sent up their first satellite, the Kobe satellite, well, actually, the first one was the balloon satellites. There was a special name for them. I forget what that was. And they sent them up into the sky to take pictures of the outer space. And that was the first inkling they had. This was back in 1978, that the microwave radiation that was discovered by Penzias and Wilson in 1963 was not as smooth as it was purported to be, or that was predicted by the Big Bang Theory. Okay, it was a lot rougher out there than the Big Bang Theory would allow, and which Penzias and Wilson didn't pick up. But these more sensitive instruments that were developed by 1978 began to pick it up. They saw it. So they couldn't make heads or tail of it, wondering what the cause of it was, where it originated from. And so they sent up the COBE satellite, and that was about 500 miles above the Earth, and it circled the Earth, and it took pictures of outer space. And the agitation in the so-called isotropic space was confirmed. So what they found in 1978 was confirmed. That space wasn't as smooth as they thought it was, or predicted that it would be. And we're talking about microwave radiation here, okay? Very, you know, it's very weak on the scale of radiation. The fact is that it's there. And if you're going to predict a theory of how the universe began, you're going to have room for the microwave radiation. Otherwise, your theory will not be complete. It could be totally false then. So the COBE satellite found this anisotropy in the microwave radiation, and they again didn't know what to do with it, you know. And so the best they could come up with, well, maybe this was a fluke in our instrumentation. Maybe it's not really there, but it is an artifact of something else, or maybe you know, our instruments are not as sensitive as they should be, or whatever. And so they went to work creating a much more sophisticated satellite, and that was called WMAP. That's an acronym for the Wilkinson Microwave Anisotropy Probe. Now the key word there is anisotropy. So an anisotropy is a disturbance in the smoothness, okay? And what I like to compare it to is, you know, let's say you have, you know, the old milk bottles they used to send us back in the 1960s and 70s. You would open up the milk bottle, and at the top would be a bunch of fat globules, okay? And if you just shook it up a little bit, the fat globules would go right into the milk, but you could still see them floating around in the milk, unless you shook it up really hard and dissolved those fat globules, okay? Well, those fat globules are what they were discovering in outer space. They were just discovering that it wasn't really smooth out there, that there were very distinct sectors of the universe that had more microwave radiation than other sectors, okay? And so the natural question is, how could that be? How could that be? You know, when things explode, they explode isotropically, unless you've packed it to explode differently, okay? But a natural explosion will just explode isotropically. Instances where you can pack the explosion to make one side explode more than the other, or to have certain particles come out, that's what we call fireworks, okay? You pack those things, but that takes organization, all right? There's no organization in a whatever they think exploding. It's just random, all right? So it's not like fireworks. This is a supposed to be very isotropic, smooth explosion, and they're finding these, you know, microwave globules all over the universe. And not only did they find them, but they found that they were organized in a way where they created an axis that went right through, guess what? Yep, you got it, the Earth, okay? It went right through the ecliptic of the Earth. And if you know anything about astronomy, you know the ecliptic is on a 23.5-degree plane with the equator of the Earth, okay? If you look at it in the geocentric sense, all right? If you look at it in the solar sense, the ecliptic is 23.5 degrees oriented between the sun and the earth. All right? But, I mean, to find that these disturbances, these agitations in space that form these pockets of microwaves were lining up exactly with the ecliptic of the Earth, 23.5 degrees. Wow. Any astrophysicist, physicist, astronomer worth his salt who saw that would know immediately that there's something special about the Earth. Immediately. There would be no question in his mind. Okay? Because their idea was that the Earth is out on the outskirts of the universe somewhere, we don't know where, and has no signpost saying, you know, we are here compared to something else, but it's out there, okay? And it's nowhere close to a center, even if there is a center. Okay, but here you have evidence now that if the microwave disturbances are aligned with our ecliptic at 23.5 degrees, okay, not 24, not 22, okay, 23.5 degrees, that says something, okay? So that's why in our movie, for example, we spent so much time quoting Lawrence Krauss, because for all the shenanigans that Lawrence Krauss is involved in, at least he was honest about one thing, and that is he knew instinctively that the evidence shown by this satellite put the Earth in the center of the universe. His other solution was either that or all our physics is wrong. Well, I'll take both, thank you. The Earth is in the center and all your physics are wrong, okay? Because this is evidence you can't deny. Now, this is something he said. He wasn't pressured to say this. This is just something he said off the cuff, all by his lonesome, okay? Nobody was asking him questions or prompting him or anything. This was his immediate reaction to the evidence. Well, the Earth has to be in the center of the universe. Wow. Would you like to repeat that on national television? Well, it didn't go that far. Because after he was challenged or not challenged, after he was approached on what he said, then he started to backtrack. Okay? He knew that he had said something that he never thought would be listened to, at least by the ears that we had, because we were listening. There may not have been many other people listening. And if they were listening, they weren't paying attention to the ramifications of what he said. But we were. And he's one of the very reasons why we made our movie. Okay? So, and he has no love lost for us, believe us. Okay? So for him to say that, it's a precious jewel that will forever go down in history as one of the most astounding admissions ever made by an astrophysicist. Or he's just a physicist, but no difference, really. So this was so astounding to the world of science, where now everyone was starting to write papers on it. Not everyone, I mean, a good number of universities were writing papers on this, and one was the University of Michigan. And they had five prominent PhD professors in astrophysics dedicated to this story. And then there was, of course, Max Tegmark and his crew from MIT. But what they were finding was, you know, they were trying to find leaks. They were trying to find problems. They were trying to find excuses. They were trying to find contamination in the instrumentation. And they couldn't find it. Okay? They couldn't find an excuse. And for example, the Michigan team had done papers on this, humongous, detailed, technical papers on this. in 2006, 2008, 2010, 2012. And each time they would come back and say, there's no change in the results. And there's no change in the fact that this is credible evidence that the Earth is the pivot point for the axis of evil. Okay, and then there's another issue called the dipole. Okay, what I've been talking about here, the axis of evil, is called the quadrupole. And I can't get into the difference between all the poles and what they mean, but just so you know that there's a difference between the quadrupole, which is the axis that goes along the ecliptic, 23.5 degrees, and the dipole, and it's called dipole because there's two poles, one on the east, one on the west. And it just so happens that the east and the west is the equator, is the Earth's equator. Okay? So the dipole, the two poles that are on either side of the other, in between them is the Earth. And in between that is the equator of the Earth. So the dipole is on either side of the equator. And sometimes they call it the equinox, because the equinox is where the sun is neither north or south. It's right in the middle, okay, during the seasons. So don't let that confuse you. The equinox is the equator, the Earth's equator. So now what do we have? Okay, we not only have the axis of evil at 23.5 degrees going through the Earth, we have the dipole radiation in outer space, ubiquitous all over the universe. And it's centered on what? Our equator, or even the celestial equator. Because if you put the Earth's equator in the middle where the dipole is, that's the celestial equator. There's no difference. Okay? So basically you have an X formed by the ecliptic and the equator, which is what the microwave radiation is oriented around. Yeah, now you can see why they're scared. Okay, now they have a convenient excuse for the dipole. They try to see what they do with the dipoles. They say, well, the dipole is caused by the fact that the sun's revolving around the Milky Way and taking the Earth with it. So we're moving at a pretty good clip through the microwave radiation, and as such we're going to get a little redshift, because as we head into the radiation it'll be blue, and that's one of the dipoles. And at the end, the other end of the Earth, the what you would call the western end, okay, that'll be redshifted, okay, and that's what creates the dipole. So in other words, their excuse is that this dipole is created by the Earth going through the microwave radiation. And it just so happens to be at our equator. How about that? Okay, but here again, what they do is they assume, because of the Copernican principle, and that's why our movie is called The Principle, they assume because of their Copernican principle that the Earth is moving. They don't know that because they have no proof of it. And that's what the other movie, you know, the one I was talking about here, Journey to the Center of the Universe, it goes into great detail about all the so-called proofs that the Earth is moving, which have now all been discredited. And I'm including stellar aberration, stellar parallax, the Foucault pendulum, the bulge of the Earth, star streaming, anything you name, it's all been discredited. And you can thank Albert Einstein for that. At any rate, that's their excuse, okay? But you know what? You're going to get the same dipole formation if the Earth is not moving and the universe is rotating around it, you see. So, you know, they constantly fall into this logical fallacy of petitio principii, which is trying to use as proof the very thing they're trying to prove. In other words, they're trying to prove the Earth isn't in the center by assuming the Earth isn't in the center, and then formulating their explanations of the evidence that they have, that they're confronted with. Okay? So, but from our perspective, you can see how excited we were about making this movie. I mean, this tiny little pea, Earth, compared to this humongous universe that's supposed to be 93 billion light years in diameter. So the bigger they make the universe, it could be 193 billion light years. The worse their situation is, because no matter how they cut it, small, large, or indifferent, they're going to have this little pea in the middle of it all as a pivot point for all the radiation that they have in this universe. How can that possibly be unless the Earth is in the center? And special, as we said. The Earth is special. And that's the whole theme of our promotion of the movie, that we are special, you see. So anyway, for those of you who didn't know, that's what the axis of evil is. And why did they call it the axis of evil? In 2004, two scientists, astrophysicists from England, Kate Land and J.O. Maguejo, coined the phrase axis of evil in a paper that they wrote. And this paper is in my book, Galileo Was Wrong. And they coined that because at the same time, we had sent our armies over to, what was it, Iraq? Yeah, we were in Iraq at that time. And George Bush had called 4 nations the axis of evil. I think North Korea was one, Iraq was another, I forget the other 2. But they were the axis of evil, and this became a byword that would be used. We're fighting the axis of evil. And so these astrophysicists picked up this term and applied it to the microwave radiation anomalies that they were confronting and called the axis of evil. So, but why would they choose that? Why would they choose evil, axis of evil? Well, because the evidence confronting them from this microwave radiation totally debunks the Copernican principle. You see, the Copernican principle says that there is no special place in the universe. It's all the same. It all looks the same. It all is the same on large scales. There's no difference from one place to the other. It's just like homogenized milk. No globules or fat in there. Okay. So when you find the fat globules in your homogenized milk, then you know something's wrong. Okay. Your theory is not holding up. When you find an axis that goes right through the center of the Earth, and you can't find any reason to doubt it any longer because you've studied it for so long, and you found out that it's not an artifact, it's not due to contamination, it's not an instrument failure, nothing of that sort, and it just keeps popping up. As a matter of fact, the more that it pops up in the 3 satellites they've sent up, the more detail they find that it is absolutely what they thought it was. Okay, so they only cut their throat deeper every time they send up a satellite. That's the nature of this beast for them. Okay, so anyway, thank you for your question. I see some of the people have come back, and I'm sorry again for I'm running overtime. Let me just see what Adam said here. Greetings, Dr. Sungenis. I was taught that the fossil record starts with simple life on the lower layers and increases in complexity. Is this true? No. You find complex specimens up high. You find simple specimens beneath and everywhere in between. Okay. What you do find is the heavier specimens on the bottom and the lighter ones on top. That's what you find. Okay. Now, there is something that should be addressed, and that is that 99% of the fossils that are found are extinct. Okay, now that's an interesting little tidbit. Okay, so how would a creationist explain that? Well, I think the simple explanation is, okay, number one, you have 1% left. Okay, and what that means is, number one is, that means you had to have a global flood. Because if you killed off 99% of the animal and plant life that was on the earth, that isn't going to happen by a local flood. Okay? That's going to be a universal flood, number one. Okay? Number two, it shows us what constituted the pre-Diluvian world, how beautiful it was, how ornate it was, how complex it was, multitude in differentiation it was. Okay, imagine 99% of the animals that existed then that don't exist now, what kind of world that was. Okay, I mean, variety beyond your comprehension. Now, we made up for that somewhat in post-Diluvian ages, because built into the DNA of each organism was the ability to vary within its species so that we would get varieties of the same species. Okay, and that's why we can have 5,000 species of birds. All right, that's why we can have, you know, a Cocker Spaniel and a German Shepherd basically coming from the primordial wolf, so to speak. And all the other varieties of dogs that we have, or cats, or frogs, or whatever. Okay, so as time goes on, we can make up for the 99% that isn't here by the variation built into the DNA that will make what appears to be, you know, another species, so to speak, but it's not. It's the same species. It's just a variety now that perhaps wasn't even known in the pre-Diluvian days. Okay, so as I said, we've made up for that 99% missing. And so, you know, this is not a complicating factor for the creation model, that 99% is missing. It just basically shows us how much we were punished, how much the sin of man resulted in God taking away the glory of the earth that it had in the antediluvian period. And now we have somewhat, you know, a small percentage of it left. Okay? I mean, we look at the rock formations at the Grand Canyon, and we look at, you know, Niagara Falls, or we look at, you know, the Amazon forest in Brazil or whatever, and we go, oh, how beautiful they are, you know. These are nothing compared to what they had before. These are the ravages left over from when the world was destroyed. And they're still beautiful. We can look at the Niagara Falls. That was, and the Grand Canyon, that was cut out by the water of the flood. So you can imagine what this land looked like before all these mountains were formed and the rocks cut out canyons and, you know, made waterfalls and all that. It's just unbelievable what it might have been, you see. So, you know, the old saying, one man's trash is another man's treasure. Well, the trash left over from the flood became our treasure, so to speak. Because we know nothing else. We don't have any concept of what it was like prior. But if we know that 99% of the fossils are not here any longer, are extinct, then we can just imagine what beauty it might have had, what variety it had. What God created was so beautiful. And that's why in each day of creation, it says, and God saw it, and it was good. It was good. Okay? Yeah. And we can imagine how good it was. All right? So, hope I answered your question. We're going to have to end. And again, I'm sorry we're cut off. Listen, if we're cut off again next week, just come right back on. Okay, just hit your button, come right back on, because Facebook is becoming very untrustworthy. I don't know what the deal is here, but at any rate, if it happens again, just come right back on, like some of you did. There's a lot of you who hadn't come back on. Maybe they don't know what to do. At any rate, it's been nice being with you. I hope I've given you a lot to think about, and I hope I have improved your life at least a smidgen tonight and brought you closer to our Creator. It's Sungenis signing off. See you next Thursday at the same time.